Although Karl Marx lived in the 19th century, he's one of the most consequential thinkers for the 20th century, and perhaps even for the 21st century too. His name is associated with everything from the critique of capitalism to the Soviet Union to even the Chinese Communist Party today. His importance cannot be overstated. So what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economic Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria. And this week, we're going to be continuing our series on free speech and the university by coming at the topic from a bit of a tangent, by suggesting that one of the reasons why free speech is so denigrated on university campuses and even in society might have something to do with the enduring appeal of Karl Marx. So as I mentioned, this video is something of an interlude in our series on free speech and the university. And I say an interlude because the object of Marx's attacks was not specifically free speech, nor was his theater of operations the university. But his influence on progressive thought is unmistakable. His connection, moreover, to the establishment of some of the 20th century's worst regimes, undeniable. So alluring and pervasive is his thought that I would argue it's strongly associated with many of the anti-free speech currents in universities and society today. By acquiring a better understanding of Marx, we'll have a better understanding of why free speech is so denigrated by some people. We'll also have a better idea of their intellectual universe, where they're coming from, and where they could be wrong. Now, a word of warning from Hayek, who says the tracing of influences is the most treacherous ground in the history of thought. Indeed, many opponents of free speech today will never have read a word of Marx, and yet that doesn't mean that they aren't speaking the same language, living in the intellectual universe that Marx fabricated. Okay, so with that said, what is the big man, Karl Marx, all about? I'll dispense with the biographical details and skip straight to his ideas. Part of Marx's enduring appeal derives from how wide-ranging his thought is. I mean, after all, it embraces economics, sociology, philosophy of history, and it does it in a very seductive sort of way, a very seductive synthesis, if you will, and all the while expressed with great style and vigor. So let's examine three interrelated dimensions of Marxist thought: economics, philosophy of history, and Marxist sociology. So first, the economics. Now, Marx was not the only progressive show in town in the 19th century. There were many utopian socialists. But for Marx, the problem is that they just weren't quite scientific enough. For Marx, it was important that his ideas be scientific. And the starting point is his economics, as outlined in his 3-volume magnum opus, Capital, of which only the first volume was completed in his lifetime. And a key point in that work are 3 interrelated theories of value. So the first one is the theory of labor value, then the theory of wage value, and finally the theory of surplus value. So what are these? Well, the first one, the theory of labor value, was actually upheld by renowned economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo. It says that the value of a good is determined by the amount of labor that's been invested in that good. So a good that requires a lot of time to make will be worth more than one that doesn't take so much time to make. And you can see that there's a bit of truth to this, right? I mean, a laborer has to be paid for all the time it takes to make a product. But of course, there are examples where the labor theory doesn't hold. A diamond discovered with very little effort is worth just as much as one that's discovered after many years of searching. Similarly, a work of art or literature might take years to produce and yet be worth very little. And conversely, Johann Sebastian Bach could compose a cantata every week, many of them brilliant and invaluable. So that's the theory of labor value. The second theory is the theory of wage value. This states that a worker's wages are equal to whatever is necessary to sustain the worker and his family. So the idea that you deserve to be paid a living wage, let's say, however one defines a living wage. The third theory, and the most important for Marx's purposes, and it builds on the previous two theories, is the theory of surplus value. This consists in the recognition that the value of what the workers produced is not equivalent to what he's being paid. In fact, he's being paid less than the value of what he's produced. So a question emerges. Where's that extra value going? It's going to the capitalist, the owner of the means of production, which means that the worker is working partly for himself, but also for someone else, the capitalist. The capitalist is making a profit by exploiting the worker. Therefore, the capitalist system itself is exploitative. Not only that, but the constant transformation of the conditions of production leads labor to be increasingly replaced by machines that do the work for them. So now you have a growing mass of laborers who are unemployed. And this is what Marx called the industrial reserve army. There's obviously a lot more, but this is the core of what's going on in Marx's economics. So now we come to his philosophy of history. And as Marx famously declared at the beginning of his Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. In the ancient era, it was slaves versus masters. In the feudal era, it was serfs versus lords. In the capitalist era, it's wage earners versus capitalists. Those are your two main groups in society, always, regardless of the society, regardless of the time period in history. On the one hand, you have a growing number of unemployed laborers, the proletariat. And on the other hand, you have capitalists, the bourgeoisie. But their number is steadily declining as they knock each other out of the market. And so they basically just end up, the ones who fail end up being subsumed into the growing industrial reserve army, into the proletariat. And at some point, you're going to have a small group of capitalists that have no one left to exploit. Of course, the capitalists might just take their exploitation abroad and begin exploiting workers in other countries. And this was an idea that was put forward by the Marxist Rosa Luxemburg. The idea is that capitalism is inherently imperialist. In fact, Lenin identified this capitalist imperialism as the cause of the First World War. But in any case, the crux of the matter is that at some point, you're going to end up with a bunch of unemployed and angry laborers and a few privileged capitalists. Kind of like the 99% and the 1% dynamic you sometimes hear people talk about today. The situation is ripe for revolution. And after the oppressed laborers have thrown off their shackles and overcome the capitalists, the entire bourgeois system, in other words, then we enter the socialist era, which is defined by cooperation over antagonism, where there's no exploitation, where there is prosperity for all. It'll be a stateless society where the means of production are commonly owned. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. Why is it that we must view history as just a history of class struggles? Why is this emphasis on class so important to Marx? To understand that, we need to look into his sociology. There's a famous passage from the preface to Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy, and it's pretty lengthy, so bear with me. All right, Marx says, "In the social production of their lives, men enter into relations that are specific, necessary, and independent of their will. Relations of production, which correspond to a specific stage of development of their material productive forces. The totality of these relations of production forms the economic structure of society, the real basis from which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond specific forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process generally. It is not the consciousness of men that specifies their being, but on the contrary, their social being that specifies their consciousness. At a certain level of their development, the material productive forces of society come into contradiction with the already existing relations of production, or in what is merely a legal expression for this, with the property relations within which they had previously functioned. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then an epoch of social revolution commences. With the alteration of the economic foundation, the whole colossal superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. In examining such transformations, one must always distinguish between the transformation in the economic conditions of production, to be established with the accuracy of physical science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophical, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as one does not assess an individual by what he thinks of himself, so one does not assess such an epoch of transformation from its own consciousness. Rather, one must instead explain this consciousness from the contradictions of material life, from the already existing conflict between the forces of production and relations of production in society. All right. So the conflict between the forces of production and the relations of production is really the only thing that's real. The forces of production are things like human labor and tools, machines, that sort of thing. And the relations of production are all those social relations we necessarily must enter into in order to survive. So they're the only things that are real. And the class you belong to is characterized by the conflict between these forces and relations of production. They are the infrastructure, or the substructure, whatever you want to call it, that everything else in our society is built upon, whether it be the laws, politics, the state, art, religion, philosophy, all of our ideas, all of that stuff is the superstructure. Even our own consciousness, our own understanding of ourselves and of reality is a part of the superstructure, which is determined by the infrastructure, these socioeconomic relations. You notice how Marx says you shouldn't assess an individual by what he says or what he thinks of himself, because he's liable to be deceiving himself. You need to be critical, right? You need to go beneath the veil of bourgeois self-deception and get to what's really going on, the socioeconomic infrastructure, which is characterized by relations of exploitation. Okay, so there's a certain elegance to the way that Marx ties together economics, sociology, history, philosophy. The ideas all seem to hang together so easily, so logically. But every step of the way, you can challenge his arguments, and it just so happens that Hayek and the Austrian School of Economics more generally has the means to do so. So let's go back to where Marx began, to the economics. You remember we talked about the three different theories, theory of labor value, theory of wage value, and theory of surplus value. And let's start there, because it just so happens that the Austrian school was built partially on the refutation of the theory of labor value. It was the founder of the Austrian school, Karl Marx, who pointed out that the value of a good is determined not by what it takes to produce it, but rather by whether that good satisfies a need. And because different individuals have different needs or different wants, value will be subjective. And Hayek fully agrees with this. And the same logic can be extended as well to the theory of wage value. Because wages are basically just the value of an individual's work. The question then isn't how much does the laborer need to sustain himself and his family, but rather how much is an employer willing to pay a laborer for the work he does, and how much is the laborer willing to work for. If the employer and the employee can agree on a wage, then they sign a contract. And if not, then the employer finds someone else and the laborer can look for a new employer. And because both parties enter willingly into the contract, neither of them can really be said to be exploited. Now, Marx would say that the problem is that it was the worker, not the capitalist, who produced a certain good. Therefore, it should be the worker, not the capitalist, who keeps the profit earned from the sale of that good. The good belonged to the worker, not to the capitalist. The problem, though, with this argument is that the worker would not have been able to produce the good without the means provided by the capitalist. If the worker had the means to produce the good on his own, then he wouldn't need to work for anyone. Actually, he could just be self-employed. Now, we should be on our guard against this facile dichotomy of workers and employers, employees, employers, which suggests that there's a perpetual struggle between those two groups. And I think the idea, the notion that there is a perpetual struggle is another one of the annoying legacies of Karl Marx. Because every worker is, in fact, a potential entrepreneur, a potential employer. There's no reason you need to feel like some exploited worker. You could start your own company. You can be your own boss. So capitalism, the market economy, isn't exploitative by nature. It's simply the result of what millions and millions and millions of different individuals have agreed on, each of them pursuing their own goals. Now, if capitalism is not exploitative, there's no reason to view history as a tale of exploitation. I mean, the story of exploitation is but one story that you can tell. There's no reason, though, why it should be the only valid interpretation of history. Why not tell a history of man's struggle for liberty, or man's quest for knowledge, or even just history on a smaller scale, you know, something like history of a particular country, of a particular era, or something like that. So there's a plurality of interpretations of history. There's a plurality of angles from which you can look at history. It doesn't need to be just about some epic class struggle. But there's also a plurality of directions in which history can move. History isn't predetermined. There are factors that can influence the direction of history. But we as individuals also have a role to play in making our future. Hayek's own life work is a testament to that. He saw already during the Second World War that the allure of central planning could persist even after the war's conclusion. So, he gathered like-minded individuals and wrote numerous books in order to warn people against the dangers of centralization and an ever-expanding state. Needless to say, none of his efforts would have been possible without freedom of speech, freedom of thought, just as none of the efforts of his detractors are possible without freedom of speech, freedom of thought. Hayek saw that history could move in an unfavorable direction, and so he did what he could in order to change its direction. You know, we're on the topic of talking about direction in history and that sort of thing. On just a side note, it reminds me of how much I detest a certain phrase that we hear quite often in public discourse today, and that's to be on the right side of history. In the interwar years, because what does that mean? If you go back to the interwar years, 1920s, 1930s, progress, being on the right side of history, that meant siding with the communists or the fascists or the Nazis. Being on the right side of history in those years was to be a totalitarian, because those were the ideologies of the future. They promised the world, they promised everything, they promised utopia. Liberal democracy, by contrast, appeared inefficient, boring, old. So being on the right side of history demonstrates not only one's ignorance, but also one's moral cowardice. It suggests that you already know what direction history is moving in. And it also argues that you'd better get on the winning side beforehand. It's really just another way of saying might makes right. Whichever side wins is morally just. It's fatuous and pusillanimous. All right, now for Marx's sociology. If there's a plurality of interpretations of history, then there's no reason why we have to focus specifically on class struggle. Furthermore, Marx's idea that politics, ideas, religion, etc., are all determined by the conflict between the forces and relations of production is overly simplistic. What's to say that, for example, policy changes, such as raising workers' wages or improving benefits, won't prevent class war and revolution? For all of the dynamism of Marx's philosophy, there's something curiously static about his understanding even of the relations between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. As I just mentioned, he assumes that they are irrevocably opposed to one another. He doesn't allow for the possibility that the proletariat may want to become just like the bourgeoisie in terms of habits and lifestyle, or even in the desire to start their own business. He excludes the possibility of competition, that one of the employees of yesterday may actually become an employer tomorrow, may knock out competitors. So Marx doesn't talk about competition, which is central to Hayek's thinking. But where Marx's ideas have had perhaps their most nefarious influence on modern progressive thought is when it comes to the sociology of knowledge. And this is the idea that your very thoughts are determined by your social class. This is something that Hayek devotes a few pages to in his Scientism and the Study of Society. For Hayek, the sociology of knowledge prepares the ground for irrationalism, and this is what he has to say about it. If truth is no longer discovered by observation, reasoning, and argument, but by uncovering hidden causes which, unknown to the thinker, have determined his conclusions, if whether a statement is true or false is no longer decided by logical argument and empirical tests, but by examining the social position of the person who made it, when in consequence it becomes the membership of a class or race which secures or prevents the achievement of truth, and when in the end it is claimed that the sure instinct of a particular class or a people is always right, reason has been finally driven out. And why is this? Well, Hayek says this is because reason's the product of inter-individual relationships. It's the product of individuals exercising their free speech, engaging with one another in conversation and debate. So what Hayek sees in the sociology of knowledge, in the Marxist attempt to attribute our ideas and our very process of reasoning to some social prejudice, be it class or race or gender, is the very subversion of reason itself. For Hayek, it's reason unhinged, unaware of its limits. And this is obvious because the people who adhere to the sociology of knowledge, who put forward arguments along these sorts of lines, always somehow think that their views are excluded from it. Hayek notes on this, he says, those who hold these views have indeed regularly some special theory which exempts their own views from the same sort of explanation, and which credits them as a specially favored class or simply as the free-floating intelligentsia with the possession of absolute knowledge. So, despite all of these obvious flaws in Marx's thought, why is it still so enduring? Why do we still see aspects of it materialize in modern progressive thought? I'd say there's at least two reasons. The first has something to do with Marx's underlying philosophy of man. When Marx speaks of the theory of labor value, he sees the goods produced by laborers as literally crystallized labor. So a part of you has gone into making that product, and now it's just going to be bought and sold willy-nilly. For Marx, the capitalist system effectively dehumanizes people. And this is what Marx called alienation. In pre-capitalist societies, human relations were still direct, but under capitalism, All human relations appear to be mediated through commodities and the market. This is the logic here, according to Marx. Concrete labor from flesh and blood human beings ends up producing formalistic, turgid, abstract exchange value. And it just doesn't seem right. It doesn't feel right to us. Now, we know that Hayek, from a previous video, we know that Hayek thought that this abstract society or great society or open society is more just and produces more moral outcomes than the pre-capitalist tribal societies. But as we also observed in that earlier video, it can be more difficult than we think to leave behind our tribal instincts. And so what does Marx envision at the end of history, in this socialist utopia? Well, he sees an end to human antagonism. And as Marx says, an end to human antagonism where each person is not restricted to an exclusive sphere of activity, but can rather train himself in whatever branch he wishes to. Society, regulating the general production, and thereby making it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, rearing cattle in the evening, criticizing after dinner, whatever I feel like, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. So this, for Marx, is true freedom and human dignity, where you can work, I suppose, at whatever it is you feel like doing at any given moment without ever actually having to work, where there is no scarcity, no antagonism. But there's another reason, I think, for Marx's enduring appeal. As Leszek Kołakowski, whom the Polish philosopher I mentioned in the previous video, as well as the French philosopher Raymond Aron point out, Marx's thought is equivocal enough to lend itself to all kinds of interpretations. It can be repurposed as people see fit, and it combines some of the most characteristic ideological themes of Western thought. It's a seductive mixture of four things here. So one, rationalism determinism, Prometheanism, romanticism, and Christian aspiration. Let's take that first one, rationalism determinism. Marx's philosophy prides itself on having science on its side, or at least it thinks it's a science. Science means you can prove something to be the case. It's not just ideology, right? I mean, that's always one of the easiest ways to discount the arguments of your opponents. Is just say, well, what we're practicing here is science. We're being pragmatic, that sort of thing. What you're doing is you're just being ideological, right? So as soon as you have science on your side, you can say that everything else, any contrary view, is just ideology. So that's one of the appealing things of Marx, is this rationalist determinist scientific sort of side to it. You have to accept it because the science says so. And truth be told, there is something attractive about our moral beliefs being confirmed by science. Aron points out on this matter, he says, how can one resist such a system where science demonstrates that necessity will execute the verdicts of conscience? Capitalism, condemned to death not for, but by its intrinsic injustice. The rationalism determinism of it places it squarely within the Enlightenment tradition of which we are all children. This is the overzealous rationalism to which Hayek was opposed, the idea that a central authority such as the state could rationally plan society. On a side note, Hayek's criticism of Marx centers mostly on this theme, the rationalism determinism theme. And I think that's actually a shame, I have to admit. So because consequently, I think Hayek misses out on just why Marx and the various forms of Marxism are so inexhaustible and appealing for so many people. Although amusingly, in an interview in the 1970s, Hayek stated that one of the reasons he didn't finish his work on a massive project he was working on, The Abuse and Decline of Reason, is because he would have had to read Hegel and Marx, and I quote, he couldn't stand diving into that dreadful stuff. Okay, so rationalism, determinism, that's the first theme. The second theme, Prometheanism, which is closely related to the first. The primacy and mightiness of man over nature, our ability, perhaps even our right, to remake society and the world. Our ability to absolutely determine our own destiny. There's a certain arrogance and grandeur to Marxism that flies in the face of all of the imperfections of human nature. It's the idea that we can identify the injustices of the world and we can and will correct them for all time. That human history will play out exactly in accordance with our good intentions. That accidents or errors born of ignorance are impossible. So that's Prometheanism. The third theme, Romanticism. Because despite its pretensions to scientific status, Marx's philosophy and its modern-day variations are all a bit romantic. Like the romantic of the 19th century, they are disgusted with commercialism and modern society, the alienating effects of capitalism, the feeling that we're somehow not whole, that in society we're somehow invisible, we're not seen, we're not appreciated for the full and diverse and beautiful individuals that we are, with all the hopes and dreams that we deserve to realize. The romantic is ultimately unsatisfied with pluralism, because in pluralism, he sees division. He sees the division, one could say, within his own soul. That sometimes he's a father, sometimes he's a son, sometimes a worker, sometimes a consumer, sometimes a citizen, and that in each and every one of these roles, he has to put on a different mask. He's never really himself. He never really achieves that unity of individuality that he aspires to. And so what does the romantic do? Well, he either removes himself from society and becomes a hermit to seek out this unity and solitude, or he seeks to stamp out the messy pluralism of society by imposing unity on it, by forcing society to cater to his will. Anytime you hear someone blaming society for disadvantaging a group of people, whether defined by class, race, or gender, whatever, and suggesting that it's society's fault and society's duty to better accommodate this disadvantaged group or this allegedly disadvantaged group, this is a form of romanticism. Society is a collection of individuals. How are you supposed to make all individuals better accommodate some group? I mean, sure, you can convince some individuals to better accommodate a particular group of people, but you can't convince everyone. There will always be dissenters. You'd have to force them, actually. You would need a totalitarian society where everyone thinks and acts alike, which is the exact opposite of freedom. And even then, you wouldn't achieve the unity you seek, because acquiescence bought by coercion is never as satisfying as assent given freely by autonomous agents. And that assent can be given freely only through free speech, the exchange of ideas, the attempt to convince others through force of reason, which implies the acceptance of opinions contrary to your own. Okay, so Romanticism. The fourth and final theme, Christian aspiration. Because like Christianity, Marxism sees an end of history, a point at which all human antagonisms will be resolved, and competition in the market is typically seen as an example of antagonism. It emphasizes the messianic role to be played by a chosen people, an underdog, a victim group, in Marx's case, the proletariat. The chosen people must always be a victim group, for as the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once said, human truth is found on the side of the victim. The look of the unfortunate makes us conscious of our privileges by revealing their intolerable injustice. That could have been written literally just today. That sounds so familiar, doesn't it? Human truth found on the side of the victim. Much like with Romanticism, claims of social justice, grievance studies, these sorts of things are all variations of this perverted Marxist Christianity. It commands religious, but like a religion though, it commands religious devotion from its adherents, and the punishment for apostasy is great. It's a secular religion for people who have lost their faith and yet still yearn for something to believe in. It combines despair at the present injustices of the world with the desperate hope of a better world to come, and yet it's all the more dangerous than a transcendental, than a sacred religion, because it assumes that utopia can be found or can be made on earth. These four themes, rationalism, determinism, Prometheanism, romanticism, and Christian aspiration, exist in one form or another to varying degrees in all forms of progressive thought, and they're all combined so seductively in Karl Marx. But there's a final key element, actually, and I'll conclude on this point. Marx has a call to action. As he famously states in the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. Activism. Now, if this is the intellectual world you inhabit, or the intellectual world you know some people to inhabit, then the defense of free speech must sound like it's kind of missing the point, right? You've identified the problem, the injustice, you know how to solve it, but you can't implement the solution. You haven't successfully managed to do that, or maybe it just doesn't seem to be working. So, because if it were working, if you could implement the solution, or if it was succeeding, then the problem would be gone. And yet we've still got problems. So there has to be a fault somewhere. Now, it could just be in your own reasoning, but no, it's not. You don't think it's in your reasoning, so it's got to be with someone else, something else. Perhaps it's the system itself, capitalism. Perhaps it's society, bourgeois society. Perhaps it's certain classes of privileged people who are impeding the solution, right? Like corporations or the 1%. Perhaps it could be the nefarious influence of evil-minded think tanks like the Austrian Economic Center and Hayek Institute that are in bed with big business and polluting the minds of everyone, responsible for everything from, you name it, whether you dislike globalism on the one hand, neoliberalism, populism on the other hand, the incipient end of the earth due to climate change. It could be that. But whatever the fault is, you feel that it won't be solved by free speech. It's just talking. And if that's the case, if that's the way you think about it, or if there are progressives you know who think about it in those terms, then that means that the university cannot and should not be a place for interpreting the world. It must be a place for changing it. And so the university's purpose and its relation to society will be the topic of our next video. And that's what Hayek would say. You know, one of the interesting things about Karl Marx and his intellectual descendants is that they always try to speak in the name of some other class. They represent some other class. And this is very typical of intellectuals in general. If you're interested in learning more about why it is that intellectuals love socialism, then you might want to check out this video here.